Now, I've talked about the concept of the noble lie before, and how in some cases it can be somewhat beneficial, maybe even quite beneficial. In other cases, it can be rather damaging or even quite pernicious. And today I want to talk about what I regard as the worst of quote-unquote noble lies. It's the worst of noble lies because it leads to so many bad outcomes and because it's so patently, obviously false. And it just flies in the face of very, very easily acquirable evidence that you can gain just by looking at the world for about 5 minutes. So I'm going to start this off by reading the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights and conscience, and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So right there we have a mishmash of several different elements. We have one, this claim that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And then we have an injunction, as it were, to suggest that you ought to behave in a certain way. Unfortunately, both components here are basically bold-faced lies. This notion that all human beings are equal in dignity, equal in value, equal in their rights. Again, spend 5 minutes in the world, use your brain a bit, observe your eyes, your ears, your senses. You will quickly come to the conclusion that that's not the case. Very specifically, the notion of human dignity and the notion of human equality, which is a trap that has led to many, many, many problems, some of which have resulted in the destruction of human life. Where in the world are individuals, or even groups, but specifically individuals, treated equal in dignity simply by dint of their existence? Probably nowhere. You see, the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that human beings as individuals possess a suite of different characteristics, qualities, traits that distinguish them from others, sometimes for the better, and sometimes, oftentimes, perhaps, for the worse. And how individuals are then interacted with, i.e. how they're treated, how people view them, how people really instinctually deal with them, that's all predicated on this suite of traits and qualities that the person had no control over. But it also automatically, necessarily leads to a different form of treatment. It leads to situations of more quote-unquote dignity or less dignity, situations of quote-unquote more equality or quote-unquote less equality. And this is basically why things of this nature, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the more hokey notions of human dignity and value and worth, being equal under the law and all these things, that's ultimately all poppycock. It ultimately makes no sense. Because in practice, this never happens. We never treat different human beings on an equal basis. It never happens, ever. And you can really start with the simplest of examples. Think about how we treat children. Do we treat children the same as we treat adults? Well, no, obviously not. A 5-year-old is treated very differently from a 35-year-old. And some people just interject and say, well, that's obvious. They're children, right? Children lack certain capacities. Their brains are not fully developed. And they have low impulse control and all these other things. We do not ascribe to children the same abilities we ascribe to adults. But it's not really a far leap from the way we treat children to the way we treat adults based on their own individual qualities. So if a particular adult is very slow, as in not particularly bright, we're going to treat them differently over time to an adult that has average intelligence, or indeed an adult that's extremely intelligent. That's just how the world is. So we're constantly engaging in different forms of treatment and interacting in different ways with people based on what they bring to the table. And of course, based on their individual attributes. Children seem to be an obvious example of marked differences between them and adults in terms of their development, and therefore we impose more restrictions on them. They're talked to differently because we assume their vocabularies are not fully developed, and so on and so forth. So that is a universal, that we always treat people differently, that there's no real equality in this sense. Dignity in the truest sense is not accorded to everybody. Not everyone is of equal value. And another obvious example would be in the context of a family. If you are a mother or father, it's almost certain that you're going to value your own children, i.e. individuals who share a lot of your DNA, more than people that you don't share DNA with. Now, that's not always the case, but it is almost always the case. And your average person would also think it's absurd if you were to say you're supposed to care more about your neighbor's child than your own. Again, this is kind of baked into the equation, but it goes way beyond this basic stuff. And so effectively, we're stuck with a dilemma. We don't in practice treat people with equal human dignity or value or worth. We don't in practice interact with people in the same way because they are different at the individual level. And the same broadly applies to generalizable rules about groups. We don't treat people, quote unquote, equally. But we've been feeding ourselves this nostrum for quite some time, i.e., we are all equal in value and dignity and blah, 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 even though it flies in the face of reality, and it's just not true. You just need to spend a little bit of time, as I said, 5 minutes or so, looking at the world, your place in it, and how others are treated. And there are tons of other examples of this. We talk about inkwells sometimes. We talk about how unattractive people are treated. You can talk about how people that are less cognitively gifted are treated versus the opposite, etc., etc. This also applies, obviously, in the case of law. We know, for example, that women receive different sentences for identical crimes in the case of the law and courts. So there are many, many examples of this. Now, because this is so obvious to observe, i.e. that we're not all treated equally, with equal dignity, with equal value, blah, 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 this leads to problems. Now, at this juncture, I might invoke the notion of the utility of religion, because in the religious context, say the Christian context, you might make the claim, something in fact that you will hear often from Christian believers, that we're all equal in the eyes of God. Now, that's a transcendental claim, right? You're not going to see it in the kingdom of man, as it were. You're not going to see it in the mortal realm, but somewhere beyond this mortal realm, somewhere in the context of God's kingdom, outside of this realm, wherever that might be, He, i.e. God, loves us all equally, and so on and so forth. And that does some work, much more work, I would argue, than simply claiming on a piece of paper that we all have equal rights and are equal in our human dignity when there's nothing to back it up. Now, of course, there are problems with the divine claim to this as well, because it begs the question why God would create so many different individuals, so many different qualities and attributes that then lead to these disparate outcomes and different ways of being treated. But that's a different question, obviously. But again, untethered to the divine, the claim that we're all equal in dignity and should be treated equally, blah, 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 seems to be much more tenuous. And where does this lead? Well, people don't believe it because in their day-to-day lived experience, a term you might hear frequently from Zoomers and millennials these days, they don't see it. They don't see it. They see differences all around them in how people are treated and this and that. And they often come to rather specious and strange conclusions as a result of that. But has anyone actually asked the question why people, especially these days, are obsessed with equity and equality in a way that you could hardly compare to former times? Well, a lot of people, for example, Sargon Akkad, will say this is a natural consequence of liberalism. You have a liberal system, it leads to this. Well, maybe, but unless you want to refute the claim that we're all equal in dignity, value, and should be treated as such, well, I don't know what you're supposed to do, because that seems to me the source of all of this, ultimately. You look at the world, you're told that you're basically, quote-unquote, the same, or at least you should be treated the same, because you have equal value and dignity. When you don't, if you're an ugly mofo, you'll know right away that that's not the case. If you're slow on the draw, you'll notice that other people are running laps around you. If you're very short as a man, you'll notice these things, all these factors that contribute to different ways of being treated, right? And you notice this, and then some people start getting very upset, and some people start organizing, and some people start changing the very nature of the culture, the laws, the education, and so on and so forth. The key here is this so-called noble lie that just doesn't work. It arguably barely works with the divine mandate, as I said, because it begs the question, if we're all equal in the eyes of God, why did God create us all so differently? And of course, there's a lot of weird apologia you could engage in if you're a religious person, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that it seems obvious to me that the reason why everyone is so nuts these days, the reason why they're so obsessed with equity and equality and this and that, is because we still cling to this quote-unquote noble lie that is probably the most pernicious one out there, and probably the one that's so easily refutable just by living, just by existing and breathing, just by observing things. It's so obvious if you have eyes, ears, a somewhat functional brain. And finally, the notion that you could actually remedy this, which is what all this activism is about, is silly. Quote-unquote inequalities, as well as being treated differently, is baked into the system. And it's not fair, and it never will be, but you cannot actually remediate unfairness. At the end of the day, that's how I would phrase it. I've talked about this before. There's no real way to remediate unfairness. It is what it is, as people like to say. And this is why I think, in this particular case, we'd all be better off if we were honest and we just level with ourselves and say, look, this is one of these so-called noble lies that we don't really need anymore because it leads to so much destruction. I don't like any of this obsession with equity, equality, all the social justice, all this nonsense that has engulfed us in the last 10 years, any more than anyone else. But I think people are looking in the wrong places for solutions. I think we, in this case, need to say, honestly, publicly, look, the cards you are dealt mediates how you will be treated in life completely. I think we need to get rid of this mantra, this nostrum of we're all equal in human dignity and rights and da-da-da-da-da-da, because it only leads to destruction. Now, the alternative, as I said, is to level with people and say, look, that's how the cookie crumbles. It's not great, but it's better than what we've been doing now. Because a lot of people, not just SJWs, inkwells, others, get upset when they realize rather quickly that life has baked in unfairness, that we are treated differently based on effectively random distribution of attributes, and they get upset. And you can make an argument that in the 20th century, communism and various destructive political movements that led to the termination of human life en masse at times was also a consequence of this. Because people, for example, like Sargon, would still argue that we should be treated equally under the law or something like that. But we don't ever do that effectively because we're biased apes. We are biased human animals. So we should get rid of the whole framework and just say, nope, it's not fair. Everyone will be treated differently, just as we treat children differently from adults, just as we treat women differently from men and vice versa. Individuals who are different from other individuals are going to be treated differently. And if you level with people, and you make that clear from the get-go, rather than continue and persist with this nonsense of human dignity and equality, that's just not true. We don't do this. We don't engage in this type of behavior. I think we'd all be better off. Anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. Many special thanks to my patrons. You guys are the best. Without you, the channel simply couldn't exist, as well as my donors on PayPal. And if you can engage in the usual YouTube jazz, if that helps, I have no idea. Like the video, share the video, sub if you're not yet a sub, leave a comment, etc., etc. would be much appreciated. Until the next time, if I'm still alive, may the gods truly watch over you. Until then, bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.